Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to another episode in our Season 2 finale series in which we're recapping major genre groups across the entirety of the 1990s. In today's episode, we're talking about video game music, which is exciting because there wasn't really enough of it to talk about in the 1980s, and by the 2000s, it's already basically over. So this is our one moment to really dig into video game music. Just as a reminder, this is a series of episodes in the finale in which we're recapping genre groups across the decade, so if you're interested in listening to any of the other genres in this series, feel free to check those out. As well, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I discuss in today's episode, check out the playlist that I've linked in the description of the episode here. And then finally, if you're looking for my 1990s big list in which I've collected all of the most important, impactful songs, in my opinion, from the 1990s, I'll be dropping that in conjunction with the last episode in this recap series. So look out for that too. So, what are we going to talk about today? As usual for this recap series, we're going to start by reviewing what we recapped in the 1980s for video game music, which was mostly around our check-ins because in the Season 1 1980s finale, we didn't talk about video game music because there just wasn't really enough to talk about. So we're going to recap our check-ins. Second, we're going to overview the subgenres we'll be discussing today. And then third, we're going to dive into each of the subgenres with milestone songs across the decade and why we chose them. So, in the 1980s, for those that were listening in Season 1, might have recalled that I sporadically did a video game music check-in, because we don't really do check-ins anymore, but back then we did a check-in on video game music, which is to say that you weren't expected to listen to the music necessarily, but I was more giving the listeners an indication of what was happening in the world of video game music at the time, so that when we did start to get to video game music soundtracks that were on our essential list, you were ready to better understand them because you had a little bit of context leading up to those moments. So in the latter half of Season 1, so 1985 onward, we started to do a video game music check-in. And what I said back then, just at a high level, is that there were three major companies that were delivering quality soundtracks at the time. One was Capcom with the Mega Man or Rockman franchise, Konami, who was putting out the Castlevania franchise, and Square, or as it became later known, Square Enix or Squaresoft, with the Final Fantasy series. Those three franchises were mostly carrying things forward in the 1980s, where I'm sure people were very familiar with things like Super Mario Bros. By Nintendo, but oftentimes Nintendo's music is fairly simplistic and more atmospheric and adds to the moment, and it isn't necessarily its own defined quality of music. Like, it's good, it's memorable, but also it's not so undeniably memorable that it's important for us to really dig in and talk about it. That was mostly where Capcom, Konami, and Square lived, in that highly definable music. Having said that, the two major genres of video games between those three groups is Japanese role-playing games, which is more your Final Fantasies, and then your platform games, which is more your Mega Man, Castlevania, Super Mario Brothers, things like that, where oftentimes it's a side-scrolling adventure like Super Mario Brothers, and there's usually stages to it, and there's defined songs that go for each one. So it's not necessarily a hard-coded story, it's more just a linear progression that you go on, and the game gets progressively harder as you go along. So when we talk about the major subgenres that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about those two. And the first we're going to talk about is just platform games generally speaking. And then the other is Japanese role-playing games. And within Japanese role-playing games, there's several different varieties of songs within the soundtrack that have evolved over time in their own different ways for different reasons. The four major subgenres that we're going to talk about within those kinds of soundtracks are battle themes, character themes, dungeon themes, and town themes. So, let's start off by talking about what a Japanese role-playing game is, briefly, before we dive into our first subgenre, which is battle themes. So let's first start off by discussing what a role-playing game is. So a role-playing game, at least by video game estimations, is the player takes up the role of somebody in the story, either one person or a team of people, and they go on some sort of adventure in which you, the player, are acting through that character in order to go on a fairly epic journey. That often is what a role-playing game is, generally speaking. So the thing about Japanese role-playing games being such a complex subgenre within the video game music space and such a driver for so much of the music within the video game music space is that it expects that the composers of these soundtracks are creating these wide sweeping stories that can be told just purely through the music. And I think that we talked about that at length during season 2, in which we went through the 1990s, and we did talk about some of these Japanese role-playing game soundtracks, such as Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy Tactics, Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger, things like that. So in an ideal world, the composer is doing a few different things at the same time. One is that they're creating a song that deeply encapsulates the moment that the player and those characters find themselves in. So it's a totally iconic moment, not just because of what happens, but because of the music. So the music adds something to what they're seeing, and it really helps add color to the little ones and zeros that have been coded into this game to elicit this moment. So the music's purpose is to help add to the moment and add that extra sensory moment into the whole greater picture so that the player's really feeling like they're part of that moment. Additionally, it needs to be technically excellent, like it's well executed, it's well composed, it's well played. And then finally, that it can be listened to by itself outside the scope of the game. And firstly, it sounds great by itself. You don't need the game in order for it to sound great. And though, it's so good and so completely tied to that moment that you listen to that song and it immediately puts you right back in that headspace of that moment. So it successfully is a great song. It successfully brings you back to that moment after the game's already over. It successfully adds to the moment when you're in the game, and it's just composed impeccably. So it's a huge bar that needs to be overcome in order to be successful here. A lot riding on this. So when we talk about battle themes, so moving into the first subgenre here, first of all, Nobuo Uematsu is one of the kings of a battle theme for Japanese role-playing games. He's pretty quintessential. There's a few specific people that stand out, and I would say that there's a select few composers in the realm of video game music composers that have been fortunate enough and received the honor of crafting battle music for a well-regarded video game. It's not entrusted to just anybody. It is given to very, very skilled people for all the reasons that I just listed out about what makes a video game music song critical. So to start off with, we're going to start in 1990 with the first wave, and waves don't really exist here so much. It's more the first generation of video games because this is still Nintendo or Famicom. And it's the Final Fantasy III original soundtrack. So we've already done 1 and 2. 1 and 2 were in 1988 and 89, so we're in 1990. And it is the first battle theme from the Final Fantasy III soundtrack, and it was created by Nobuo Uematsu. Unsurprising. This song is just a really great way for us to baseline our understanding of battle themes. It's got that very particular lead up, that da 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 thing. And that's very quintessential Final Fantasy music. And it carries through, I think, essentially all of them, even from Final Fantasy 1 all the way up through, I don't even know what, because I stopped playing them after a while. They carried through all of the ones that I was familiar with. It's pretty much a signal immediately that you're listening to a Final Fantasy battle theme right off the bat. The composition of the song is highly complex because it's got lots of layers to it, which I think is one of the themes that we're going to experience here over the course of this whole discussion across all these different subgenres, that the complexity is going up. The way that Nobuo Uematsu is using this synthesizers in order to create different interesting sound effects. So whoever's his sound engineer is giving him a lot more to work with in order to create these highly interesting sounds that is certainly still back in that first gen Nintendo style where it's pretty limited on the whole. It does have that driving beat, and it does make you feel excited about getting into this battle. More so than the previous two, you can actually hear that there's a little bit of a punch behind the song, where if you did happen to go back and listen to the battle theme for Final Fantasy 1 or Final Fantasy 2, this one has a little bit more of a beat to it, and you can hear it almost immediately. It's got a very dynamic cadence to it that is even more interesting than just listening to the first two soundtracks. So it's a good way for us to calibrate on where we're starting here. But the very next year, in 1991, we get to the second gen with the Final Fantasy IV soundtrack, and it is the first battle theme, also by Nobuo Uematsu. And I just want you to listen to how different this sounds. When he is given this next generation video game system in the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom in this case, and just hear what he's done. He's created actual instruments. It doesn't just sound like beeps and boops. It sounds like actual instruments. There sounds like there's violins. There sounds like there's trumpets. There sounds like there's actual timpanis in there. It sounds real, or at least it's getting more real than what was happening in the Final Fantasy III soundtrack. And it's just wide and it's sweeping and it's got quite the dynamic to it. And it sounds like almost a fully entirely realized song. And the levels to it are just so much more so than the battle theme from Final Fantasy III. It's just taken to even greater heights. Personally, it's one of my favorite battle themes of all time just because of how sweeping it is and how the instrumentation is just so impeccable again. And it always puts me right back in the headspace of 1991, listening to that song for the first time and just thinking, wow, that is different and interesting. Very much not just regular Nintendo. So then in 1994, we're still in the second gen, so this is still Super Nintendo, and we move to the battle theme for the Final Fantasy VI original soundtrack, also by Nobuo Uematsu. Much like going from the battle theme from Final Fantasy 1 and 2 to this one where it's got that punchier beat to it, you can hear between Final Fantasy 4 and Final Fantasy 6 that, again, it's taking a lot of that instrumentation and that orchestral vibe of the Final Fantasy IV soundtrack, which was legitimately much more fantastical and a little less techno-fantasy like Final Fantasy VI is. And it's just got edgy guitars and, again, that driving beat behind it. It sounds a little less like an orchestra piece and a little bit more like a rock piece. And it's just continuing to evolve what's possible with the different soundscapes that these sound engineers are affording and giving to, in this case, Nobuo Uematsu, so that he could take it to that next level. And it perfectly fits with the different vibe between what Final Fantasy IV and its high fantasy was like and what the techno fantasy of Final Fantasy VI is like. It's still got a little bit of that fantasy in there, but it's also got a little bit of those driving guitars as if it's a more modern game, a more modern idea. It's not just in Lord of the Rings style fantasy. It's fantasy, but there's definitely some technology in there, so it's a little bit harder and metal than that. It's very interesting. And then next, we move 3 years into the future from that into the third gen on the PlayStation with the Final Fantasy VII soundtrack, again by Nobuo Uematsu, and it is the battle theme for that game. Interestingly enough, you should very much be able to hear the connection point between the Final Fantasy VI battle theme and the 7 battle theme. They sound very similar to each other, with the exception that Nobuo Uematsu has been given more tools to play with for this battle theme because Final Fantasy VII is also a techno-fantasy story, like an upgraded, bigger version of what Final Fantasy VI was playing with. So it should be clear to anybody that's a fan of Final Fantasies at this point that it's going in that direction of kind of fantasy, kind of technology. It's kind of putting those things together, probably to give the coders and the storytellers more options and how to create a dynamic world and a story. So you can really tell in the Final Fantasy VII soundtrack that whatever Nobuo Uematsu was playing with in Final Fantasy VI's battle theme becomes even more fully realized in the Final Fantasy VII theme. But at the same time, it's brought a little bit back at that high lilting notes that existed in Final Fantasy IV. So it's taking a little bit of what was great about the 4 theme, a little bit of what was great from the 6 theme, and putting it together into this totally different package that, again, sounds totally distinctive for the game and for the moment. So it's quite the triumph where he managed to thread that needle between basically more fantasy and more technology all at the same time to create this bigger song. It's genius. So then next we move laterally, so 1997, same year, but we move to a different franchise, to the Saga Frontier original soundtrack by Kenji Ito, and it's the first and main battle theme for the game. The reason that this is next in our list is because, first of all, we've been going through Nobuo Uematsu's journey for 7 years at this point. But on the back end, Kenji Ito has been making battle themes for Romancing Saga 1, 2, and 3 on the second gen systems, and then finally for third gen comes out with the Saga Frontier soundtrack, and this battle theme is very much evolved off of what Nobuo Uematsu was doing in Final Fantasy VII's battle theme. It's far punchier and it drives harder. The complexity of the song is way, way up. It actually makes the battle theme from Final Fantasy VII look fairly simplistic. The battle theme from Saga Frontier is deeply complex. There's many, many, many layers to it. It's really alive and it's very exuberant and it just drives hard. And it's also using a lot less synthesized mimicry of orchestra instruments and just really leaning into the just heavy straight ahead synth in order to get the job done. And yet it sounds more dynamic and more complex. And it is a composition difference between Nobuo Uematsu and Kenji Ito's visions for how they think music should go along, but they've been working around one another as Kenji Ito's been doing the Romancing Saga angle and Nobuo Uematsu's been doing the Final Fantasy angle alongside each other for years and years and years and years. So it's just different flavors of the same idea, but in my opinion, evolved. And then finally, we get to 1999 again with the third gen because fourth gen doesn't come along until until 2000, 2001 with the Chrono Cross soundtrack, which is the sequel to Chrono Trigger, which we talked about in the 1995 episode. And it's still by Yasunori Mitsuda, who also did the Chrono Trigger soundtrack. And the track is The Brink of Death, which is the boss theme from Chrono Cross. So the reason that this song is at the very end of our list, not just because it's in 1999 and it just happens to be at the end, is it's brought all of these pieces together. So it's orchestral, it's deep, it's driving, it's complex, it's got a lot going on. And it's just such a complete and utter evolution of what battle themes could be in a video game, just because it at once feels like a distinctive moment, right? If you're in this battle theme and you're playing as the characters and you're trying to win the battle, it feels intense. And at the same time, unless you go back and listen to the rest of the soundtrack, which I absolutely do recommend that you do, it just wraps around the entire theme of the soundtrack in its entirety. It just feels so completely integrated to the rest of the game. It doesn't just feel like, for example, in the Final Fantasy III soundtrack, where the battle theme doesn't sound inherently connected to the rest of the soundtrack. It's just the music that you hear when you do a battle. In The Brink of Death by Yasunori Mitsuda on the Chrono Cross soundtrack sounds completely integrated. It sounds like it's part of the story of the game, and yet you just keep getting into these parts of the story that happen to include fighting, and in this case, fighting big monsters. But it's all integrated. It's all completely together and cohesive and still putting forth a completely and utterly undeniable perspective about what this game is about, how the player needs to feel about going through this game, and that the battles are part of it. It's not just that this is a separate moment in which you found yourself in a battle and separate music and different ideas are happening. It's totally integrated. So that's why it's a great way for us to end our discussion on battle themes. So next, let's talk about character themes. You could probably guess by how this is named that in most soundtracks, not so much in the first gen, but as we get to second gen and beyond, in Japanese role-playing games, almost all the characters that are ones that you could play or villains or what have you, all have very distinctive themes, much like many great movies. Think about Darth Vader's theme, for example. If it's playing, you know immediately that this is supposed to be adding somewhere in your brain that this is about that character, or even if it's the music is playing for that character but they're not there, it's supposed to remind you in your mind that something about this moment in this scene is relating back to this character. So it becomes kind of a hallmark of Japanese role-playing games because much like movies, it's a really important part sensorily of telling the story. Interestingly enough, the music does evolve over time, and it evolves in kind of a different way than battle themes did, where battle themes became more about integrating with the rest of the story so that it all seems like one cohesive journey rather than a non sequitur. Character themes just become more deeply complex and makes you feel more for the character, and it just gets used much more effectively and liberally as time goes on, because video game music composers and story writers and coders just learn more the importance of creating fully realized, fully fleshed out characters that have their own distinctive personalities and themes to them, so that when things happen to them, the player feels more deeply for them, right? So to start off with, we're going to go to 1992, second gen, because again, there wasn't really a lot of it going on in first gen. And it is the Romancing Saga 1 original soundtrack by Kenji Ito, and it's the theme of Albert, the young nobleman. So this song is basically just a really great way to ground us on what a character theme sounds like. I mean, in this particular case, Albert being a young nobleman, the theme really makes you feel that, right? And this is second gen. So this isn't like battle themes where you get into a battle and it's just sort of happening. The goal that Kenji Ito was going for with this theme being so early in the character themes saga, because this was only 1 year after Final Fantasy IV came out, and we just started to get into character themes with Final Fantasy IV, really, meaningfully, that this one was just trying to tell that story about who Albert was, and you didn't even have to hear what he had to say. You didn't even have to look at him. You didn't have to hear his story. You hear the music and you just understand immediately kind of who he is and what he represents, right? That should be the whole point of a character theme, that you don't have to see him. You don't have to do anything. You, as the listener, probably have not played Romancing Saga. So listening to this theme, you are the exact kind of person that this music is for, because you hear it and you understand this character before you've even met them, period. That's the point. But is it simplistic? Totally. It's very simplistic. So let's move then into a little less simplistic to 1994, so 2 years later, again, second gen, with the Final Fantasy VI soundtrack, again, Nobuo Uematsu, and its Realms theme. This theme has increased the emotions considerably from Albert's theme from the Romancing Saga soundtrack. You probably feel a little bit more for Realm just based upon how you're listening to her music, and maybe a little bit about what you know about her without even meeting her. It sounds very much like home. It sounds very much like she's kind of weird and silly, and it sounds a little bit like there's an ennui about her to a certain extent, and all of that is completely true. Now, I know this game very well, so I am probably reading into this a little bit, but if you didn't know any of that about her as a character, just listening to this music should give you some of those markers, and it should be fairly easy for you to connect with her, at least in that auditory way. Even if you've never met her before, you still kind of get who she is. And that's the point of this evolution, is you better and better and better get to understand who these characters are, and it makes you feel for them even more because of those critical moments where you got to understand their music and their theme, and then stuff happened to them, and then they play the music again and it hits you right in the heart. That's the whole point. So then next, we move 1 year into the future to 1995 with the Chrono Trigger soundtrack by Yasunori Mitsuda, and it's the Shala theme. So it's the theme for the character Shala in the game, who, frankly, she's a side character. Realm, playable character. Albert, playable character. Shala, not a playable character. And most people who are extraordinarily familiar with the Chrono Trigger soundtrack and familiar with video game music will all collectively admit that Yasunori Mitsuda did not have to go as hard on the Shala theme as he needed to, because Shala was in the story for approximately an hour out of the 40 hours, 50 hours that the game requires in order to complete it for the first time without any direction or any hints or any cheats or anything like that. She was in it for a tiny fraction of time towards the middle late part of the game, and this song, if you know the story of her, will just rip your heart out, right? But for those of you that are not familiar with the song, because I'm not going to spoil the game for you, is that it's even more complex, it's even more well thought out than Realm's theme. It taps into even deeper emotions about this character. Like, you can hear this and think, okay, she sounds a little mystical. She sounds a little haunting. The music is sad but hopeful in a way and driving. So I'm getting that vibe just by listening to whatever this is. Like, I've never met Shala before. I don't know who she is. I don't know what her impact on the game is. But this music makes me feel like something meaningful happens for her. And it's a little otherworldly. And just taking all that into account, hearing that is the point. That's why this is an evolution off of Realm's theme, because it's taking those ideas of introducing you to the character and making you feel for them as quickly and effectively and clearly as possible. And Yasunori Mitsuda crushes it with Shala's theme. It's widely regarded as one of the best character themes in all of video game music history, period. So I'm glad to give that to you, because I don't really think that we talked about Shala's theme when we talked about the Chrono Trigger soundtrack in 95 episodes. So I'm giving that to you. And then next, 2 years later, we do get to the third gen in the PlayStation with the Final Fantasy VII soundtrack, again by Nobuo Uematsu, and it's Aeris's theme. And I don't think we necessarily talked about Aeris's theme when we talked about the Final Fantasy VII soundtrack in the 97 episode, because it was an essential album for us. But it's taking the heartfelt, deep emotions of Shala's theme, and it's taking it to the absolute next level. It's undeniable. It makes you really feel for the character because it's played during a very pivotal moment in the game. Again, not going to spoil anything, but it just really, whoever the player is, I don't care who you are. If you're playing this game and this theme comes on, even in a vacuum, you're going to immediately go back to the moment that the song was played in the game, period. It's also going to make you feel like 1,000 different emotions all at the same time. It just hits you right in the gut and in the heart. And even as somebody who's never played this game before and never heard this song before, it sounds deep. It sounds emotive. It sounds important. It sounds meaningful. And it's got wild depth to it, and it's very well composed. Nobuo Uematsu clearly was very focused on making sure he got Aeris's theme right, because it is a pivotal moment in the game, but also it's a totally iconic song. If you asked a lot of people what another character theme might be that is one of the most critical of all time and most widely regarded, Aeris's theme is probably number 2, maybe number 3. It's critical music, critical listening. And then finally, we get to 1999, again with the Chrono Cross original soundtrack by Yasunori Mitsuda, and the track is called The Girl Who Stole the Stars, which is Kid's theme. So the character's name is Kid. And the thing is, even while I'm talking about this, I'm becoming emotional just talking about the track itself, because Kid's theme is, again, an evolution off of Aerith's theme, off of Shala's theme, off of Realm's theme, just going all the way back. And this song just hits so hard. It's such a beautiful, wonderful song that is one of Yasunori Mitsuda's best, and he's got a lot of bests, but this is one of those really, really great ones. And I don't even totally remember exactly when it happens in the game, but it hits hard. I know that much, because this music to me, even though I don't totally remember exactly when it happened, it still hits me somewhere deep in my soul when I listen to this song. And so because of that, it's just a total triumph, isn't it? Because the whole point of writing music in any capacity is to connect, right? And I connect to this song. This song connects to me. It connects me to the game. It connects me to that moment in the game. It connects me to the character that this music is about. It connects me to all of those things. It just seems like a total pinnacle of the character theme idea across Japanese role-playing games across the decade. I can't even remember or think about where we're going next with character themes as we go into the early part of the 2000s, as video game music really starts to wane meaningfully. I'd like to believe the character themes is one of those things that sticks around and does endure, where some of these other subgenres start to fall away and just become more atmospheric as video game music continues to evolve, which is basically what happens. But if nothing else, character themes kind of endure, and I'm excited to get there, because The Girl Who Stole the Stars is a treasure, and it really just shows how much of an absolute master that Yasunori Mitsuda is, because it's just a fantastic song. So next, let's move it into the subgenre of dungeon themes. So much like there being battles and characters in Japanese role-playing games, there's also dungeons, the place where you fight all the monsters, right? Because there's towns where you don't fight monsters, there's dungeons where you fight monsters, and then there's like the connective tissue between the two. And the thing I'll tell you about dungeon themes before we get going here is that the way that they evolve over time is just that they make you feel better connected to the dungeon that they're in any one point in time. Whereas for Final Fantasy 1 and 2, or Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever that were on the Nintendo, they certainly are meant to be interesting and not overtly annoying, because they are going to be repetitive, because these characters are probably walking through these dungeons for a while trying to fight monsters, get out, go through the maze, find the boss, whatever it is. So it can't be too annoying, but it also needs to ideally be distinctive and different from all the other dungeon themes, so it seems like a different place that you're in, even though the tiles look about the same. Maybe they're a different color, but there wasn't a lot of coding distinction or uniqueness in the Nintendo. So the dungeon themes needed to be that thing that makes it seem like this dungeon is different than that dungeon, because there was like 50 dungeons in the first couple Final Fantasy games. So because of that, the music was the thing that made it different. And as time goes on across the 90s, it's not that it's about it being different, it's just another opportunity to add to the story by saying, we're at this part of the story, we're at this part in the journey, and you can really feel the weight or the importance of being at this part in the story versus it just being a unique song that isn't repetitive and annoying. So let's start in 1990 with the Final Fantasy III soundtrack again, first gen Nobuo Uematsu, and it's the Crystal Cave theme. You can even hear the beginning of the track where it sounds like the character's falling, and then they land, and then the music starts. There's many reasons why this is a good way for us to start, right? Because it sounds like we're being dropped in the middle of these dungeon themes, and you're given that really clear indication of what we're doing here, because it sounds a little bit haunting, it sounds a little bit spooky, it sounds a little bit intense, and it doesn't sound like we're in a town and everything's nice and fine. It sounds like we're on a journey and we have something to do here. And you could also think about how this song enmeshes or doesn't with the battle theme from Final Fantasy III, which we talked about at the beginning of the episode, right? Because those two things are linked to each other very much so. The battle theme from Final Fantasy III was the thing that you heard every single time you got into a battle in the Crystal Cave. You'd be going along in the Crystal Cave, listening to the Crystal Cave theme, and then you get into a battle, you do the battle theme and the fanfare at the end, which is also attached to the track. And then you go right back to that Crystal Cave theme, start it all over again. Again, it couldn't be too repetitive or else you get sick of it and you'd turn the music off, which is not the point of the song, right? Because the music adds to it. So if it gets too annoying and you decide you want to mute it, you've lost, right? You have not done an effective job as a composer. Because of that, it's a little repetitive, but it does make you feel like you're going on that journey for sure. So then 1 year later, we get to the second gen with the Final Fantasy IV soundtrack, because Nobuo Uematsu was very good at doing those early stage dungeon themes with the track Within the Giant, which we did talk about in the 1991 episode as an essential track on the Essential album. So Within the Giant is definitely a dungeon theme because you're walking around in a place where there's monsters, so it's a dungeon theme. But it's far more complex, it's far more dynamic, far more interesting than Crystal Cave theme was. It's not necessarily adding to the story so much yet, but it is making you feel like you're in a very specific dungeon, a very specific dungeon. Like the Crystal Cave theme could have been in a bunch of different places. Like listening to this music doesn't remind you of crystals. It doesn't remind you of being in a cave or a crystal cave. But Within the Giant, and the giant in this case is a giant robot that you're having to navigate through to shut it off. This sounds kind of like that. It sounds like it's really epic. It sounds like you're going through this giant machine to try and shut it off. It sounds like that. So Nobuo Uematsu, just in 1 year's time, and given the capabilities of the second gen system, has created this song to create this moment. And you can very clearly hear how it's connected, not necessarily to the story, because I don't think we're totally there yet, but it's at least connected to the place that you're in that is a distinctive dungeon. In that way, it generally adds to the story. So 3 years later, we get to the Final Fantasy VI soundtrack, again with Nobuo Uematsu, and the track is Kefka's Tower. So this is the final dungeon of the entire game, Kefka being the last boss of the entire game. First of all, this track is amazing, and it sounds far more evolved than Within the Giant was. It's clear that Nobuo Uematsu in that time has very deeply evolved his understanding on how to create really excellent dungeon themes, even more so than he has for the last several years across all the Final Fantasies so far. And Kefka's Tower is a really interesting theme because it ties back to what we said earlier about the battle themes and how Final Fantasy VI was this techno fantasy. Kefka's Tower sounds like a techno fantasy, right? It's got those high driving, buzzing sounds like it's rock music or metal music, but it's got those violins and those trumpets on top of it that makes it sound fantastical. It's fantastical, it's a techno apocalypse, it's everything. And it does really very much match with the battle theme from Final Fantasy VI. You kind of put those two things together and they match very well. And this is also the first time we start to get into that realm of the dungeon theme, not just very much telling the player that this is a special place and you're going to remember this forever and you're going to remember this theme and every time you hear it you're going to think about this part in the game, but also it's connecting back to the story because it feels like it's more part of the story than any of these three previous themes. It feels a little bit connected. It's not totally there, but it feels more connected. So then 1 year later, we get to the Chrono Trigger soundtrack by Yasunori Mitsuda again, and it's Secret of the Forest, which is the general forest dungeon theme, because most Japanese RPGs have some kind of forest dungeon thing. It's pretty much a hallmark. So what's really interesting about this track is that it better integrates into the greater soundtrack. So it sounds more connected to the rest of the soundtrack in its totality versus Kefka's Tower or Within the Giant or Crystal Cave. They sounded kind of still like the early battle themes where they sounded like just their own separate moment, as if to say that when this game was being coded, the developers were creating just one tile set for each of these different places that the characters were walking through, and they were all very distinctive and they weren't connected together. They weren't connected meaningfully. This song, though, Secret of the Forest, sounds like everything is very connected. This sounds very much like the field theme that you listen to getting to the forest. It sounds like the battle theme a little bit. It sounds like all the music that's around this place, and it all feels like it's all connected together. The interesting thing about this song, even though it's not necessarily as hard driving and complex as the Kefka's Tower theme from a year ago, it sounds better integrated into the story itself, which is why Yasunori Mitsuda is a genius and considered to be one of the great composers of video games of all time. Because even back in 1995, he was figuring out that you could create these hauntingly beautiful tracks and pieces, but it all threads and works together, even geographically and chronologically in the game. Like if you know you're going to go from this place to this forest and then to another place, make sure that all the music connects together so it seems like one cohesive idea and one connecting story that just links all the way around itself. And also has distinctive callbacks so you still feel like you're part of this game, it's this specific game and not any other game, and that you're connected to different moments in time throughout the game through music so that there's a little bit of nostalgia, you're a little bit connecting dots in your mind, in your ears, on how this song relates to other songs across the entire game, because it is all one world, right? Basically, basically just genius. It's connecting those dots ever better. So then 2 years later, we get to the third gen with the Breath of Fire 3 soundtrack, and we basically didn't talk about the Breath of Fire franchise at all, but it was by Capcom. So the Mega Man franchise and the Breath of Fire franchise, for the most part, were building each other up approximately the same time as second gen was starting to happen. So you can really kind of hear the similarities if you really want to go on a journey of Capcom music, how the entirety of the video game music department of Capcom was all kind of growing in the same direction at the same time. Even if it was a platform game or a Japanese role-playing game, it was all growing in one direction. It was very funny. And the artist in this case was Akari Kaida, and the track is Turning Point from 1997. This is the final dungeon, as far as I can remember, from the Breath of Fire 3 soundtrack. I'm pretty sure that's the case. And it sounds very deeply connected to the game. It sounds very deeply connected to the story. So we were just leaning in even further to what I was talking about previously, from Secret of the Forest and so forth going back, that this doesn't sound like a distinctive dungeon song. Like, it feels like this song was always just there, and the characters were just going on this journey and walking through this dungeon, and it was just a completely seamless, continuous moment where it seemed obvious that this would be the music that was happening in this place, which I think is that next order evolution of dungeon themes, that the soundtrack has been crafted so well and the perspective around the soundtrack is so clear that as you're getting to certain points in the game, the music should sound familiar to you, even if you've never heard it before. Even if this is the first time you're hearing this song, it should hit in your mind that, yep, this sounds exactly like what the music should sound like in this moment in time, with this kind of tone, with these kinds of stakes. This is what it should sound like. And Turning Point on the Breath of Fire 3 soundtrack is just a really great example of how that happens, where it's a completely and utterly logical song that should be getting played at this point in time in the game based upon the rest of the soundtrack that's led up to this moment, which, if you're interested in listening to that context, go listen to the Breath of Fire 3 soundtrack or play the game if you want to. It's on the PlayStation. And I'm sure it's on the PlayStation Network at this point, so you can probably get it there too. And then finally, we get to 1999, still in the third gen, with the Saga Frontier 2 soundtrack, which we did talk about in the 1999 episode. The composer is Masashi Hamauzu, and the track is Zaubermarschen. And it's not necessarily the final dungeon, but it's very, very, very late stage in the game. And basically, the evolution between Turning Point and this is just that the instrumentation has increased. The quality of the music has just gone up and up and up, first of all. And second of all, this song is even more integrated into the story of the game. It's a little bit difficult for me to paint that picture without actually going into great depth about the Saga Frontier game itself. But suffice it to say that this song sounds completely and utterly in place with this moment. And it's not necessarily to say that this song makes you really feel like you're in a Zaubermarschen, but at the very least, it makes you feel like you're at a meaningful point in the game with these characters, with all this context that comes along with that. And this song is more about bringing all this context home for the players and less so about it being about the place itself, which I think is that meaningful evolution, because where Crystal Cave was about being non-repetitive and defining that you were in a place where monsters are and you fight them, and Within the Giant was about defining a very specific dungeon that you were in, and Kefka's Tower was about a certain degree of playing up the theme of the villain that you're about to fight and the weight of the moment that you find yourself in, and there is a finality to it. And Secret of the Forest is more about how there's this throughput and this thread that connects all this music together, and Turning Point is about how it's obvious that this should be the moment that we play a song like this because it just fits here. That Zaubermarschen is Masashi Hamauzu is basically using the fact that there is a dungeon here in order to tell a deeper story through the music that just happens chronologically to be a dungeon. And yet it all works because in a way it does sound like a dungeon theme in itself, but at the same time it doesn't, because the composer was just using this opportunity to continue on the story of these characters through music, and this just happened to be one stop along the way. So it's taking those Secret of the Forest ideas and those Turning Point ideas and taking it up a notch even further and saying, I don't even care that this is a dungeon. I'm just going to tell the story as the story lands, and if you happen to fight monsters while you're here, that's great, but it's not meaningful, right? So that's the evolution. So next, let's talk about the last part in our Japanese role-playing game saga here, with town themes. So first, we're going to go back to 1990, Final Fantasy III soundtrack, Nobuo Uematsu, and it's In the Covert Town. So In the Covert Town is just a good baseline for us on what a town theme sounds like. They sound happy, uplifting. They sound not like a dungeon theme, so it sounds safe. It sounds welcoming. That's pretty much classic town theme back from Final Fantasy 1, 2, Dragon Quest, Dragon Warrior. It's just the place where you feel safe. Period. So it's a good baseline for us. Moving forward next into 1992, we get to the Soul Blazer original soundtrack on the second gen by Yukihide Takakawa. We didn't talk about the Soul Blazer original soundtrack at all. It's pretty good. Definitely not essential, but good nonetheless. And the track is Lively Town. So this is the Happy Town theme. So there's two different kinds of town themes in Soul Blazer. One is the sad version before the hero saves it, and then the happy version once the hero saves it. This is the happy version once the hero saves it. You can hear that it sounds safe, right? It sounds joyful. It sounds uplifting. It sounds like we've achieved something great. So it's basically taking that town theme that is just well-meaning and nice and safe, and we're actually doing a little bit more with it to help better tell the story about what's happening in the town versus it just being about a safe place for you to not get attacked by monsters. It's doing more with this very limited trope that exists, which Yukihide Takakawa is capitalizing on, because I'd like to believe the story of all of this is that these composers are both frankly getting more bold with how they're infusing music into the stories, but also just continuing to push on this narrative that the music should somehow add to the story. And in some of these cases, the composers are leaning out and saying, no, the music is the story. And for as much as it's really great that you guys are coding this and that and the other, and there's levels and magic and swords, the music is the story. We're just leaning even further into that very bold perspective. So then we move 3 years into the future, once again with the Chrono Trigger soundtrack, Yasunori Mitsuda, and the track is Corridors of Time. Yasunori Mitsuda is kind of a master at town themes, generally speaking, kind of like how Kenji Ito is a master of battle themes and Nobuo Uematsu is amazing at dungeon themes and character themes. Yasunori Mitsuda is amazing at town themes, so this is the first that we're going to talk about, and it's on the Chrono Trigger soundtrack, Corridors of Time. Once again, much like the rest of this story, it sounds very distinctive. It's really putting you at a place in time. And it's, first of all, a very excellent song. Very excellent. It's got layers to it. It's very complex. I mean, Yasunori Mitsuda is a freaking genius. And it sounds distinctive. It's not just a well-meaning, safe place. It's not just helping you a little bit inch along the story that like something's different and distinctive about this with like Lively Town from the Soul Blazer soundtrack. This sounds like a very specific place, a very specific moment that the characters find themselves in that is safe, but also there's more going on here than just about being safe. There's a vibe about this place. There's story, there's history, there's a depth here that you may very well not even be able to explore as the player of these characters. But whatever you're not able to glean from the little explanation or exposition that's given from the coders and developers to the player, the music gives you plenty. And I'll tell you this much, Corridors of Time and Shala's theme, they sound related, don't they? They happen about at the same time in the game. So gives you another hint about what goes on there. And then next, 3 years later, we get to the third gen, again with Yasunori Mitsuda on the Xenogears original soundtrack, which I think was a conspicuous absence maybe for the 1998 episode. And the track is Shavat, The Wind Calls. We didn't talk about any of the tracks around the Xenogears original soundtrack because, again, it's not essential. It is very good, though. The theme for Shavat, which is a town in the game, it's a very specific town, which should, again, tell you everything you need to know about the increasing importance of town themes. That, again, it's not just about any town and being safe or something happened in order for this town to be the way that it is, or that there's something around the story with this place that is meaningful and you may not even get to understand through the course of the game, but you get more from the music. Shavat's theme takes it even further than that. First of all, it's a beautiful song. It's one of my favorite video game music songs of all time because there's just so much going on here. And it really paints the picture about this specific town, what it's about, what's important about it, what's meaningful about it, and maybe even some hints about what goes on in this town as part of the game. So it's just taking Corridors of Time and upping the ante even more. And then finally, in 1998, to capstone everything, once again with the Chrono Cross original soundtrack, also by Yasunori Mitsuda, the track is Henri in the Homeworld. Without going into great depth about Chrono Cross, where Chrono Trigger was about traveling through time in the same place, Chrono Cross is about two worlds that are in a multiverse that are connected to each other that are approximately the same. It's the same time, it's just slightly different things have happened in each world, so they have a home world and then they have another world. But it's basically the same world, it's just different stuff has happened, so it's kind of like a string theory thing. So in this case, this is the town of Henri from the home world. It's basically just taking the greatness that Shavat was bringing forward by Yasunori Mitsuda a year ago, upping the ante even more. It's even better. It's even more complex. It's even more meaningful. It hits you in far more meaningful ways, kind of like character themes. Like, we're definitely getting to character theme levels of remember this moment, remember how important and meaningful this was. You get a very strong vibe just from the music of this place. Like, if there was no music here, you'd certainly get a little bit of a vibe of what's going on, but the music adds like 500% more to what this is than just what the coding gives you, which is that journey of town themes, is that it was a little bit like a placation and a signpost for players back in 1990, but by the time it's 1999, it's like most of what a town is about. It's mostly about the music and just a little bit about what's going on in the town. So it's completely and utterly flipped the power dynamic between the dev saying this place is a town and you hearing the music and thinking, okay, those two things are kind of related. Sure, fine. I don't feel like I'm in a dungeon by listening to this music, all the way to this sounds like town music. And as a result, I just presume that I'm in a town, right? It goes the total other way. So that's really the evolution and the journey of town themes across Japanese role-playing games. So now let's talk about platform games in their entire capacity. So when we talk about platform games, as I said before, it's not like Japanese role-playing games. It's usually action-based. Oftentimes there's some sort of side-scrolling component to it in some form or fashion. The platform broad genre has a lot of subgenres beneath it. Like, for example, Super Earth Defense Force, which was in our 1991 episode, that was a side-scrolling airplane platform game, or Streets of Rage 2 is a beat-em-up platform game, but they're all platform games at the end of the day. They're not puzzle games. They're not Japanese role-playing games. They're not even adventure games to that meaningful degree. It's a platform game. So because of that, we're just going to go all the way through the decade across the entire platform genre. So to start off with, we're going to begin in 1990 with the Mega Man 3 original soundtrack. And this one track is by Harumi Fujita, and it's the Needleman stage. I don't think in our check-ins in the 1980s, we actually dove into any of the actual tracks of the Mega Man 1 or 2 soundtracks. I think I probably kept some on my big 1980s recap list. And if you listen to the whole thing or happen to stumble upon those tracks, they're tucked away in there. This is the first time I actually get to call out a Mega Man track of any kind whatsoever and put it on an essential list of any kind. So it's a big, exciting moment for me because the Mega Man soundtracks were just a boon. And the Mega Man 3 soundtrack was no different. It was fantastic. So talking a little bit about the evolution of platform games, using Needleman stage as an example, the music was complex. It was having to do a lot with very little, right? Because all of these beeps and boops and sound artifacts were all only available to the composer through the sound engineer who was creating sound effects for the game itself. So like for Mega Man, like his shooting sound or a jumping sound or a getting hit sound or whatever, the composer had to use all of those sound artifacts to create music, which is wild. I can't even imagine how they did it back in the day. It's just crazy. So Needleman stage takes what is given to Harumi Fujita and just does a really excellent job creating a really interesting, engaging, fun song that sounds distinctive and giving you a little bit of a refresh on Mega Man games. So usually the format of a Mega Man game is there's like 8, 9, 10 different bosses with each distinctive stages, and Mega Man goes to those stages, goes through the stage and navigates it and doesn't die, and then fights that boss, takes their power, and then can use it against all the other ones and eventually goes off and fights Dr. Wily or something, who's the boss of all these Mega Man games. So because of that, all these Mega Man soundtracks have 8 to 10 distinctive stage songs, and they all have to sound very different from each other, and they also have to tie back to the idea of whatever enemy it is, like Needleman, Frogman, Fireman, Iceman, whatever it is. They all have to kind of follow that theme of that villain because the stage itself is basically just a big giant theme park from hell for each of those different bosses, right? So Needleman stage has a bunch of needles in them, or Frogman stage is in a forest and you have to navigate through that, or Bubbleman stage is underwater. It's stuff like that. So the music has to follow the stage, which has to follow the boss. So that's just kind of how it works. So Needleman stage is no different. And again, it's just fun. It's just a good way to ground us and baseline us for where we're at coming into 1990. So next, in 1991, we moved to the Mega Man 4 soundtrack, and this track specifically was written by Minae Fujii, and it's the Dr. Wily Stage Part 2 theme. So usually while you're going through the end game of a Mega Man game, there's multiple stages in Dr. Wily's castle that you have to go through. So this just happens to be the second stage of the Dr. Wily endgame track. And there's a couple reasons why I do this one. First of all, because it's really excellent as a song. It's evolved considerably off of Needleman from a year prior. Even though it's different composers, it's still the same amount of technology. It's still first gen. Because the thing about Mega Man games is they went all the way to 6 in the first gen before they moved over to second gen with Mega Man 7. So they were pretty behind the curve. And so for Dr. Wily Stage Part 2 in 1991, Minae Fujii was throwing everything but the kitchen sink at trying to create a wildly impactful, important, awesome, rocking theme with just whatever was available. Like there's even one moment in the song where it sounds like an explosion sound, and it doesn't sound remotely appropriate to put it in there, but it's understood that it's just like a big percussive moment that just comes across sounding like an explosion. Because of that, Minae Fujii is just trying everything that is possible in order to create this really awesome blow-off theme for this game and just doing absolutely everything possible. And so the bounds of what's capable on the first gen were getting stretched to the utmost trying to make this track. And so that's why it's that evolution going forward off of Needleman stage. So then we move laterally in 1991 to second gen, because by 1991, second gen was already out. So Mega Man 4 was having to compete against second gen already. So it was already kind of behind the curve. But the soundtrack is the Super Earth Defense Force original soundtrack, which we did talk about in 1991 by Tsukasa Taoda, and the track is Premonition. You could just hear it's 1991. It's the same year as Mega Man 4 came out with Dr. Wily Stage Part 2, and Premonition sounds like it's light years ahead. Light years ahead. 50,000 light years ahead, which is sad because Dr. Wily Stage Part 2 is really excellent first gen, like kind of chiptune style video game music. Premonition is in a totally different place. Totally different place. It's deep, it's rocking, it's got actual instruments associated with it. If you remember the rest of the Super Earth Defense Force soundtrack, it's totally connected to the rest of the songs in the soundtrack. It's doing that video game music of quality thing where it's adding to the moment, because this is just a side-scrolling airplane moving up and down, shooting at stuff as it comes across the screen. Like, it's pretty simple stuff, and yet it's adding all of this emotional depth to the moment, to the stage, to the part of the story, which frankly, again, is not that deep because you're just in an airplane flying through space shooting at stuff. It's not that complicated of a story, and yet tracks like Premonition are giving you so much more than you probably needed in order to enjoy this game. It's totally unnecessary, and yet it's wonderful and beautiful. So then just 1 year later, we move to the Sonic the Hedgehog 2 original soundtrack, which we didn't talk about at all during the 90s. Sonic 1, 2, 3, Sonic and Knuckles, any of that stuff. We didn't talk about any of it. And the track is The Chemical Plant Zone. And the composer is Masato Nakamura, who is one half of Dreams Come True, which is a J-pop band, which I kept many of their albums on my big list all the way through the 90s. So if you're really interested in listening to more of what this vibe is when there's actual music and not the limitations of the second gen Sega Genesis from 1992, go listen to that, because Dreams Come True is pretty good. I mean, I kept it on my big list, so you can enjoy it. The reason that we put the Chemical Plant Zone track on here as the next one is because it's just that leap forward. It's taking what Premonition was doing and just adds even more of that dancey vibe to it. It sounds like it's really getting into that groove, where if you're honestly going back and thinking about the Super Mario Brothers theme that all of us can imagine in our minds without even trying, this sounds so much more evolved. It sounds like dancey music. It sounds like it's got a perspective behind it. It absolutely doesn't need to be here in order to be adding anything meaningful to the Sonic the Hedgehog 2 game, because Sonic 2 is already plenty hard as it is, in case you played it or never played it. I mean, it's a platform game, so platform games just generally get harder and harder and harder as time goes on, because that's just how the ante must be upped, because the story doesn't change substantively, so the difficulty has to change. The Chemical Plant Zone, it rocks. It's great. It sounds distinctive for this chemical plant zone that you're playing in, as Sonic the Hedgehog in this case, so it's got a distinctive character to it. For people that are very familiar with Sonic the Hedgehog and Sonic the Hedgehog 2, listening to this immediately places you in that place in that moment. So it does that thing it's supposed to do in 1992. So it just does all of those things. It started to really clear the way for a perspective to be held. For sure. Next, we move laterally, again in 1992, to the Streets of Rage 2 original soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima, and the track is Dreamer, and we definitely did talk about this track in the 1992 episode. The reason that this is a lateral move and yet evolved, just listen to it. Chemical Plant Zone still sounds a little bit more mechanical. It sounds a little bit less composed and a little bit more the beeps and boops were just really well organized together. Dreamer sounds like an actual dance track. And this is also, too, because it sounds like house music, which we definitely talked about in the 1992 episode about how the composers of the Streets of Rage 2 soundtrack were pulling very heavily from house, acid house, trance, break beats. They were pulling from all that stuff. They were very, very, very ahead of their time. And Dreamer is just a really great connection point between Chemical Plant Zone and whatever comes next. So here's the thing, though. By 1993... approximately, a couple different things happen. One, just for the logistics of this show, there starts to be far, 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 far less music available on Spotify for platform games that were coming out post 1993 for whatever reason. There's a very, very small amount of them, and most of them are just later stage Mega Man franchise stuff. So we're pretty limited on that. And then some Castlevania stuff, but by then the soundtracks have kind of evolved out of being meaningful hits into themselves and more just atmospheric and just generally adding to the background of a game. So at once, the music starts to disappear for us. But then two, and you can actually tell this if you go and listen to some of the platform video game music that did exist during this time, some of which is on Spotify, but we're not including it because as time goes on, the music for platform games becomes much, much, much more atmospheric. It becomes much more the background to the actual game itself, as if some stylistic decision was made collectively across video games that, first of all, there needed to be fewer platform games as we moved into newer eras like the second, third gens of the world, and that the music needs to be either not getting in the way of you playing the game because the games are getting legitimately harder in order for people to still find interest in them, but that the music isn't interesting. It's almost as if it's purposefully made in order for you to ignore it. And in only very rare cases is the music meaningful enough in critical moments, if there even is a story, for you to pay attention to it. But again, it's like few and far between. And it's not really expecting the composers to go really hard on them. Like for soundtracks like the Streets of Rage 2 soundtrack and tracks like Dreamer, the game was mostly about the songs. It was mostly about the music. We swung way in that direction that it was basically about the music. And from there, we just sort of crashed in the other direction where companies and developers didn't care so much about what the music was, and so they weren't bringing in the heaviest of heavy hitters to challenge us on what we're listening to while we're playing the game. I think a really good example of that is the Streets of Rage 3 soundtrack that was also by Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima, that so much of the music is very complex, very interesting, but also kind of assaulting and gets in the way of actually just trying to focus on the game. And it's almost as if that one example somehow told the rest of all game developers that we need to throttle back all the way on how interesting the music is around platform games so that people are just focusing on playing the game and concentrating, and we're not giving them much more than that because we don't want to be an impediment to them succeeding, right? So it's a stylistic choice. It was a logistical choice. It's interesting. So because of that, there's this huge gap that exists. But fortunately for us, we have one final last example, which is just a remixed version of the Mega Man 4 soundtrack, Dr. Wily Stage 2, this time by Takuya Miyawaki. And it happened in 1999. And it was when all of the Mega Man games, so the first 6, were ported to the PlayStation, and they updated all of the music to create a new fun feel. So if you have an interest in listening to what the interpretation of quality platform music is in 1999, I'm giving you Dr. Wily Stage Part 2 on Mega Man 4 soundtrack for the PlayStation, so you could hear first what it sounded like in 1991 when Minae Fujii did absolutely everything possible in order to birth this thing into existence, and then Takuya Miyawaki taking that song and having an infinite amount of tools in order to create this remixed version, and this is what it sounds like. It almost sounds like this is what it was supposed to always sound like, except Minae Fujii just didn't have the tools, didn't have the capabilities. And so it's just taking those ideas and bringing them to life as much as they possibly can. So it's just a nice way to capstone platformers because, like I said, post 1993-94, the whole music in those things, with the exception of a couple like Kirby Superstar or Sonic and Knuckles over 1993, 94, 95, it all just kind of evaporates, unfortunately. But that's what it is. So having said that, what'd you think? What did you agree with? What'd you disagree with? As a thoughtful video game music listener, did you agree with the breakouts of battle theme, character theme, dungeon theme, town theme? Did you agree or disagree with what I said about chunking all of the platforms together? Did you disagree that there was this just sudden drop off or a steady decline for platformers and the quality music that goes along with them? Did you disagree with the idea of me doing this episode in general if you're not a video game music listener? Did you learn something? Hopefully. If you're not familiar with video game music, hopefully this whole thing was an education for you. For video game music listeners, did I miss anything? I don't think so. I feel like I kind of hit the big points about battle themes and the point of character themes and how they evolve and so on and so forth. I think I kind of did it. Obviously, there's a lot of games out there that could help tell this story in a multitude of different ways, but I'd like to believe the cherry picks that I provided here helps tell the story as much as it needs to be told. Because, like I said, I think there's about a million ways to tell the story. This just happens to be one of them. But if I missed something substantively, then I'd be excited to hear it and get all your hate mail, because I would love that. I would love to hear that. Did you learn something? Hopefully, because, I'd like to believe that this was not a subject that we dove into very deeply when we were going through each of the episodes during the season. As I've said pretty continuously, post 2005-06, video game music stops becoming a thing, really. It becomes much more atmospheric or just orchestral, and the themes are what they are, but it's kind of like critiquing orchestra music at that point, or classical music, or there's not really just a lot to talk about because the techno or the rock music or the metal music that's used is often way behind the times for the rest of the zeitgeist of any of those genres. It stops being forward leaning. It's obviously at this point by 1999, it's cresting into that moment of being just like any other music. And so because of that, all you can really do is critique it up against maybe movies or other composers in the classical space or neoclassical space. And that's about it, right? So eventually it just kind of stops being its own distinctive thing, unfortunately. But I'm sure that the composers of video game music are much happier because they can use every instrument available to them, so it's a win in many ways. But hopefully you learned something about the history of video game music in the 1990s, because this is about it. We're probably not going to talk about it very much again, and we're probably not going to recap it in the 2000s season finale. So this is it. Hopefully you enjoy it. But having said that, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I talked about in today's episode, you could check out the playlist that I've linked in the description of this episode here. If you're interested, again, in listening to my big recap list of all of the 90s, it should be dropping in conjunction with the last episode in this recap series. Make sure that you join us again for all of our other series recaps that we're going through, and also eventually for season 3 in the 2000s. Make sure that you rate us and comment wherever you're listening to us so other people can find us. Make sure that you find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod, and subscribe so that when we do drop the rest of these episodes in the series and we start season 3, that you know when it's happening and you can be right there with us. And make sure that you tell everybody that you know. Tell everybody that you don't know. Tell everybody that you wish that you knew. Because I get that video game music is pretty polarizing. It's even more polarizing than metal music, probably. It's even more underground. It's probably akin to J-pop in the 90s or even J-pop in the 80s. Like, it's a very specific community of people that listen to this stuff, and I totally get that. But it was meaningful. Absolutely. It was a meaningful moment in the history of music in the world in the 1990s, and it's critical that we get the rest of that education, because I'll tell you something, chiptunes, which comes along here in the early 2000s, early mid-2000s, becomes a thing because of stuff exactly like this. It's not because of what was happening in the 80s with Yellow Magic Orchestra or whatever. It's because of this stuff. This stuff is based upon Yellow Magic Orchestra's genius, right? Or Haruomi Hosono, for example. This exists because of that. And so being able to connect those dots between all that really, really ambitious electronic music that was happening at the very beginning of the 80s, late 70s, connecting up to this stuff that was happening in the 90s, carrying us forward into the 2000s, and how that would be integrated into the rest of musical society henceforth is really important, because you know who's played a lot of video games? Like everybody at this point. Everybody that was a millennial, Gen X, and forward, video games are part of their life. Whether or not they are a video game player, they know about them. For example, there's millennials that have never, ever, ever, ever played video games in their life, and they know about Mario Brothers or Sonic the Hedgehog or The Legend of Zelda or whatever, right? And so it's just part of culture. So because of that, tell everybody that you know and don't know. Get them to connect the dots. Get them to listen to this stuff and understand what the journey is, because it is a meaningful part of music history. And we should all be able to enjoy it and appreciate it together, because at the end of the day, none of this stuff is scary. It is literally just video game music. Thanks for listening, everybody.